This is Mexico. In terms of economic power, it is the 13th largest nation in the world and the second largest economy in Latin America. In spite of this, the United States of America, which is its neighbor to the north, frequently despises it. Mexico's proximity to the US, on the other hand, is becoming an important strategic asset that is propelling its economic growth. The two countries have significant trade relations that are beneficial to both of them, but particularly to Mexico. This is due to the fact that they share a border that is 1,954 miles long, 54 border crossings, and 4 different time zones. On this map, this is made quite clear. In order to provide a more direct measurement of economic activity and prosperity, this map shows the gross domestic product per capita for each of Mexico's 31 states. Clearly, the majority of Mexico's gross domestic product is concentrated in the northern regions of the country, which are located on the border with the United States. When compared to regions in the south, these states have a substantially lower reliance on commodities and have been able to successfully establish a solid platform for exports. Nevertheless, during the next few years, this is a phenomenon that is most likely going to go on to expand throughout the entire nation. The quarterly economic activity from 2023 demonstrate that the South, particularly Oaxaca and Tabasco, has undergone significant growth. The practice of moving a company's operations from a faraway country to a country that is geographically nearby is referred to as nearshoring, and it is the phenomena that is responsible for this unanticipated growth and development. The practice of nearshoring is gaining popularity as an increasing number of enterprises from the United States, Europe, and Asia are moving their operations to Mexico. As a consequence of this, Mexico has witnessed a boom in the amount of foreign investment, with the year 2023 reaching the greatest annual growth rate ever recorded, which was 18%. Increasing trade disputes, tariffs, and geopolitical tensions between the United States and China have made it less appealing for companies from the United States and Europe to manufacture items in China. As a result, these companies are now concentrating their efforts just across the southern border. This trend is set to continue. Mexico is a country that offers a considerable chance for development. Nonetheless, even with the most optimistic estimates, it isn't likely that Mexico will overcome China as the leading exporter in the world. Mexico became the United States' primary source of imports in February 2024, surpassing China in that position. Its economy has continued to thrive as a result of this, and it is anticipated that it would rank among the G20 countries with the fastest growing economies in the year 2023. Therefore, wage growth is occurring at a rate that has never been seen before. Without a doubt, the nation is dealing with a number of problems. Because of its chronically unequal society, in which a small percentage of the population owns vast sums of wealth, Mexico has the second highest degree of income inequality among nations that are members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. 1 in 3 people in the country are still living in poverty, which is still a significantly high percentage for a country that is working hard to become prosperous, despite the fact that this decrease from 43% in 2016 is a positive development. It is because of one of the most well-known industries in the country, which is also illegal, that this is allowed to happen. There is a long history of criminal activity in Mexico, particularly in the drug trade, which is where a large number of cartels have their headquarters. Mexico's economic growth has been slowed down as a result of these issues, which have also resulted in the creation of a sizable informal sector. This is due to the fact that high rates of violence and crime do not typically correspond with firm investment. The extraction of resources has been the primary driver of Mexico's economy ever since the colonial era. It's already been established that Mexico is a huge nation that is blessed with a wealth of natural resources. These resources include substantial quantities of silver and other minerals, which have resulted in significant mining investment throughout the country. On the other hand, the most important event that contributed to the expansion of Mexico's economy was the discovery of large oil resources in the early 20th century. It wasn't until 1916 that the Cerro Azul field was discovered. Despite the fact that it was already known that there was oil in the Gulf of Mexico, the exact quantity of oil remained unknown. It was estimated that this oil field produced roughly 260,000 barrels of oil per day when it was originally discovered, making it the most productive oil field throughout the entire planet. Mexico became one of the leading oil producers in the world at the beginning of the 20th century as a result of the discovery of these and other resources. These discoveries had a huge impact on the economic prosperity of the country in the decades that followed. Through the export of oil, the nation has been able to generate substantial amounts of revenue, particularly during periods in which the price of oil has been quite high. Furthermore, despite the fact that private companies were initially responsible for drilling and development, the Mexican government took issue with this and swiftly nationalized the sector. Pemex, an oil corporation that is owned by the state, was created in 1938. The implication of this was that the state has always been a transit point for the discovery, extraction, and transaction of natural gas and petroleum. There are a number of advantages that have resulted from this, the most important of which is that the earnings of Pemex have made a major contribution to the bank accounts of the government. Over the course of history, between 30 and 40% of the total income of the government. After the Great Depression that occurred in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Mexico's economy began to steadily expand. And by the year 1950, it appeared to be prepared for an economic boom that would take place during the Mexican economic miracle. During this time period, the country's workforce was becoming more concentrated in urban areas, manufacturing was contributing more to the gross domestic product than agriculture, agricultural output was decreasing, and literacy rates were rapidly rising. All of these factors contributed to the widespread dissemination of education throughout the nation. Between the years 1950 and 1981, Mexico's real gross domestic product expanded by 6.5% yearly, while the real GDP per individual of working age increased by 3.6%. This was despite the enormous population growth that the country experienced. It was during this period of economic expansion that the government began making substantial investments in sectors such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure, all of which were intended to improve the standard of living of the state's citizens. The proven oil reserves of Mexico increased by 151% in 1977 as a result of the discovery of additional oil fields, which raised the possibility of even more significant expansion. This revelation resulted in an increase in public spending by the government, which meant that for the very first time in the history of the nation, the demand for primary preschool education was totally satisfied. On the other hand, Mexico's situation started to deteriorate significantly around the beginning of the 1980s. Almost immediately, the utilization of oil revenues turned out to be a blessing rather than a curse. Mexico had been generating substantial export profits on the international market during the oil price boom of the 1970s, and it had been making use of these revenues to borrow a significant amount of money in order to finance its ambitions for the development of the public sector. Therefore, the debt of the foreign sector increased from $4.3 billion in 1970 to $58.9 billion in 1982. On the other hand, Mexico's export revenues experienced a significant fall as a consequence of a global oil glut that led to a severe decline in oil prices toward the end of the 1970s. Around the same time, Mexico's spending remained largely similar, which resulted in a public deficit of 17.6%. Along with other oil-exporting Latin countries, the Mexican government eventually defaulted on its loan obligations in 1982, which was the beginning of the debt crisis that began in the same year. As a consequence, the decade that followed was referred to as the lost decade, and it was characterized by high inflation, poor growth, and stagnation. Following the disaster, there was a recovery in the price of oil, and Mexico earned a substantial amount of money from the commodities supercycle that occurred in the late 1990s and early 2000s. On the other hand, the majority of commodities experienced real price growth in the double digits on an annual basis, which assisted in the beginning of the recovery of their economies. Oil continues to play a significant part in the economy of Mexico, producing 20% of the total money that the government receives. As a matter of fact, the Mexican government has, for a considerable amount of time, harbored the desire to transition away from oil as a source of income and economic growth. In the 1990s, this transition began to take place in a few various ways. Let's begin with the commercial aspect. Many trade barriers were eliminated when Mexico joined the United States and Canada in the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. Additionally, the majority of commodities and services were subject to lower tariffs, and there were less obstacles to international investment. By removing these barriers, Mexico has seen an increase in the proportion of its gross domestic product that comprises exports. They more than quadrupled to 41% between the years 1994 and 2021. And over that time period, Mexico's export value climbed more than fourfold to $465 billion in constant dollars. This is a pace that is comparable to that of countries such as Thailand and Malaysia. During this time period, Mexico has also significantly diversified its exports, shifting its focus from oil and agricultural products to more labor-intensive manufactured commodities such as automobile parts and electronic devices, both of which have undergone tremendous expansion. As a result of the crisis that occurred in the 1980s, the amount of debt that the Mexican government owed was fairly large. Notwithstanding this, considerable foreign exchange reserves have been able to accumulate as a consequence of the trade surpluses that followed the implementation of NAFTA, which has resulted in a reduction of the total amount. In addition to bringing in revenue for the government, trade has been beneficial to the Mexican economy in a number of other ways as well. In spite of the fact that NAFTA has been replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, there's been an increase in commerce and investment, notably foreign direct investment. This is due to the elimination of tariffs and other trade barriers, as well as Mexico's closeness to the largest economy in the world. Furthermore, it's expected that these flows would have increased by 60% if the agreement had not been in place. A significant number of American firms have moved portions of their operations outside of the country in order to establish production hubs and reduce expenses. Through expansion and modernization of its operations, the industrial sector in particular has benefited from foreign direct investment. As a result of the encouragement of investment that the North American Free Trade Agreement has provided, a significant number of new jobs have been created. These jobs have provided a reliable source of income for a large number of Mexicans and have also encouraged an increasing number of workers to leave their previous jobs in favor of formal employment, which provides benefits such as pensions and job security that they didn't have before. As an additional point of interest, these jobs are frequently found in industries that require higher levels of expertise than traditional agricultural jobs or jobs that require low levels of competence. Workers are motivated to pursue higher education and vocational training as a result of the growing demand for occupations that need greater levels of competence. This helps to improve the skills of the local workforce as well as their earning potential. Not only do companies in the United States engage in the practice of nearshoring, but also companies in Europe and China are beginning to do the same. They're investing billions of dollars in Mexico as a response to the growing number of trade disputes and transportation costs, which makes them fear losing their core market in the United States. In addition, the majority of these new expenditures in 2023 were from companies that had been founded in Mexico in the past. This suggests that the trend of nearshoring is still in its early stages and that Mexico will continue to cultivate its position as a key manufacturing hub. Also, the USMCA stipulates that a particular percentage of goods, such as 75% for automobiles, must be made in North America in order for them to be exempt from tariffs. Because of this, there are now more assembly factories all around the country, and consumers can reduce their costs by placing a tag that says Made in Mexico on their products. This inflow of capital is likely going to have a significant multiplier effect on the economy as a whole, particularly as expenditures in other areas, such as infrastructure and telecommunications, continue to climb. There has been some concern that Mexico may still be lacking key essential components that are required to completely advance to the rank of a developed nation, despite the fact that the forecast for Mexico's economy is generally optimistic. For the period beginning in 1980 and ending in 2019, the real GDP per person in Mexico climbed by an average of 0.7%. To put it into perspective, it is far lower than comparable nations that started off at comparable economic levels throughout the same period. South Korea experienced an average growth rate of 5.3%, while Chile experienced a growth rate of 3%. This disparity, which has remained mostly unaltered since the 1980s, can be explained by the fact that there has been a relatively low increase in production. During this time period, Mexico's economic growth has been primarily driven by an increase in the size of its labor force. However, this improvement has been partially offset by weak total factor productivity increases, which refer to the degree to which inputs are utilized in the production of outputs without sacrificing efficiency. Productivity is the primary factor that drives growth in the majority of established and rising economies. Yet Mexico has not been achieving this. As a result of their rapidly expanding workforce, there's been an increase in the number of people in the economy who are of working age. This effectively implies that they are increasing their inputs rather than making more efficient use of them. On the other hand, it's anticipated that this expansion of the labor force will come to a stop by the year 2030. And the fertility rate of the country currently stands at 1.9 children per woman, which is much lower than what is required to sustain population stability over generations. Mexico's level of education is another element that creates barriers to the country's economic development and production. Despite the fact that it is gradually getting better, Mexico continues to have one of the lowest rates of educational attainment and enrollment among countries that are members of the OECD. This will continue to be a problem that slows down the progress of the country. The workforce becomes more skilled as a result of greater education, and because of this, improved output and more productive exploitation of technologies that are already in existence can convert into better revenues. The improvement of educational results could, particularly for Mexico, be of assistance in addressing some of these structural challenges that restrict the increase in productivity. These issues include differences in the quality and accessibility of education between urban and rural areas. The considerable informal sector in Mexico is another factor contributing to the stagnation of the country's overall productivity. The vast majority of the economy in the majority majority of modern developed countries is formal businesses that are registered with the government. However, the informal economy in Mexico is mostly made up of tiny firms that are not subject to any regulations. This industry is responsible for a staggering 24% of the country's gross domestic product and 55% of employment. Informal enterprises are typically not eligible for bank loans since they're not registered with the government. Additionally, employees working in this sector do not receive benefits such as healthcare or pensions because they're not qualified for these benefits. On account of this, not only is their expansion restricted, but the amount of tax revenue collected by the government is also substantially decreased. There is a connection between this and the limited availability of credit and loans, which seriously hinders Mexico's capacity for economic expansion. The nation's financial industry is notorious for the low quantities of credit that are extended to individuals and businesses. Despite the fact that considerable banking reforms were introduced during the financial crisis that occurred in the 1990s, in the 21st century, the average percentage of GDP that was allocated to the private sector through domestic financing was only 24%, which is significantly lower than the 99% in Chile, 51% in Brazil, and 131% in Korea. An interest rate on loans that is so low is detrimental to the growth of the economy, since it impedes the development of capital, innovation, and manufacturing. What are the next steps for Mexico in terms of its economic development? It should come as no surprise that the country has a significant potential to develop into a developed country. However, as seen in our video about Germany, an economy's excessive reliance on trade can have both beneficial and negative repercussions, and the magnitude of its relationship with the United States poses additional problems. Any changes that are made to this commercial relationship in the future could have a substantial influence on the economy of Mexico, as well as the job situation in the country. This is because the United States is the recipient of 80% of Mexico's exports. This is especially critical in 2024, since elections have already taken place in Mexico and will soon take place in the United States. And the outcomes of those elections might have a significant influence on the relationship between the two countries and ultimately on their economy as a whole. However, in contrast to Germany, Mexico is located closer to the largest economy in the world. This means that Mexico is benefiting more from deglobalization and a shift away from China. Trade and manufacturing, on the other hand, will undoubtedly be the primary economic drivers of Mexico's future growth. Furthermore, in contrast to some of the European economies that we've discussed, Mexico has a young population that is expanding. This means that an increasing number of people will be entering the workforce, and they will not be burdened by hefty welfare payments for things like healthcare and pensions. As the concept of nearshoring continues to gain popularity over the next several years, it's projected that the growth rate of the nation will continue to increase. However, it is imperative that it ensures that the influx of capital and investment is utilized effectively in order to increase the economy's long-term capacity to reduce inequality. Other than that, it must ensure that the money is not wasted.